They're blasting Johnson's squad out of that house, Lieutenant.
And those Jerry's will be right on his tail.
Brunt, bring that gun up here with me.
You men over there! Cover him! Give him fire!
If America ever had a real-life superhero, it was Audie Murphy. The baby-faced farm boy who held off hundreds of German soldiers, earned every combat medal his country could offer, and somehow survived the unthinkable. But what he couldn't survive was peace. On May 28, 1971, a private plane carrying Murphy vanished into the foggy Virginia mountains. The world was told it was an accident. Weather, pilot error, case closed. For over 50 years we believed it. But what if we were never meant to know the truth? Recently unearthed documents, long-buried testimony, and forensic evidence paint a terrifying picture, one that suggests this wasn't just a tragic crash, it was a hit. The same government Audie Murphy fought for may have silenced him to protect secrets buried deep within the halls of power, secrets involving psychological experiments, whistleblowers, and a man who knew too much. This isn't just about how America's greatest soldier died. It's about why. And the answer is darker than anyone imagined. The hero America worshipped, before there was controversy, before the crash, before the whisper of betrayal, there was just a boy from Texas. A boy named Audie Leon Murphy, born into such crushing poverty that even survival felt like a privilege. He was the seventh of 12 children, raised on a patch of dry, unforgiving soil in Hunt County. His father walked out when Audie was still just a boy. His mother died when he was 16. Childhood wasn't something he lived through. It was something he survived. By age 8, he was hunting squirrels and rabbits to keep his siblings alive. By 10, he was picking cotton under a merciless sun. And by 16, he was the only thing standing between his family and starvation. No formal education. No silver spoon. Just a rifle, and a relentless will to endure. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Murphy tried to enlist. The Marines said no. The Navy turned him away. Even the paratroopers laughed at his height, just 5'5" and barely 112 pounds soaking wet. But he lied about his age. He begged. He clawed. And eventually, the Army gave him a chance. That was all he needed. In less than 3 years, the skinny kid with a 5th-grade education became the most decorated U.S. soldier of World War II. He wasn't just brave, he was terrifyingly effective. He killed over 240 enemy soldiers, was wounded 3 times, and earned 33 military awards, including the Medal of Honor. But it was what he did in Holtzwihr, France that burned his name into history. Pinned down by an entire German company, his unit was decimated. Only 19 men remained out of 128. Wounded and bleeding, Murphy climbed atop a burning tank destroyer and alone opened fire with its machine gun. He held off over 200 enemy soldiers for nearly an hour. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he led the counterattack on foot, still bleeding. He was 19 years old. No backup, no cover, no fear. When asked later how he managed it, Murphy simply said, "I was scared, and I was fighting." That's the kind of man Audie Murphy was. Not a warrior created by boot camp or battle drills, but a protector forged by hardship, hunger, and the primal need to survive. And when he came home, America couldn't get enough of him. His photo landed on the cover of Life magazine. He was a national treasure, our very own Captain America. But heroes often carry the heaviest wounds. And Audie's war was far from over. From war zones to Hollywood sets. After the parades faded and the medals were polished, Hollywood came calling. And how could it not? America wasn't just fascinated by Audie Murphy, they were obsessed. Here was a man who had actually lived the stories screenwriters could only imagine. Not some stiff-jawed actor in a costume. A real warrior, standing barely over 5 feet, who had done what seemed impossible. It was James Cagney, the Hollywood icon, who saw Murphy on the Life magazine cover and decided to bring him west. Murphy had no acting experience, no training, no agent, Nothing but a quiet intensity that made people lean in. Universal signed him almost immediately, and while the studios expected him to be a novelty, a patriotic mascot to cash in on, he quickly proved them wrong. He wasn't polished, but he was real. There was something magnetic about him on screen, especially in westerns. The way he moved with a rifle, the way he handled a horse, it wasn't acting, it was instinct. He wasn't pretending to be a cowboy. He was a cowboy who'd once swapped bullets with Nazis instead of bandits. Over the next 2 decades, Murphy starred in more than 40 films, including hits like Night Passage, The Red Badge of Courage, and No Name on the Bullet. But it was 1955's To Hell and Back that made him a true star. The film adaptation of his own autobiography cast Audie as himself, recreating his most traumatic moments in combat for a movie screen. Let that sink in. He didn't just write about his pain, he relived it. He reenacted the firefights, the death of his friends, the moment he climbed that flaming tank destroyer and gunned down wave after wave of enemy troops. Film historians call it cinematic bravery, but psychologists today would call it something else: trauma reenactment. And Murphy did it with cameras rolling and producers cheering. The film was a smash hit. It set a Universal box office record that stood for 20 years, until Jaws came along. But no amount of applause could drown out the screams still echoing in his mind. Off camera, he was falling apart. He tried writing country music, racing horses, investing in land. He smiled in photos alongside stars like Jimmy Stewart and Dean Martin. But even in a crowd, Murphy seemed alone, disconnected, haunted. He didn't know it yet, but he was already fighting the next war, one that couldn't be won with medals or machine guns. It was a war inside his own mind, and the enemy was gaining ground. Haunted off camera, the war that never ended. Hollywood could make Audie Murphy look like he'd conquered every battlefield on Earth, but no camera could hide the one he carried inside his head. When the crowds went home, he'd return to a quiet house and load the pistol he kept beneath his pillow. He rarely slept, and when he did, the dreams dragged him back to France. The smoke, the screams, the smell of burning metal. He'd jolt awake drenched in sweat, convinced he was under attack. Friends noticed the change. The once calm hero grew jumpy, distant, sometimes explosive. He'd pace his house at night, then vanish on long drives into the desert. To most, it looked like the usual toll of fame. To those close to him, it was clear the war had never ended. In the 1950s, nobody used the term post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans were told to man up. Psychiatrists called it battle fatigue, and the government quietly ignored it. But Murphy refused to pretend. Anyone who's been in as much combat as I have and says they don't have battle dreams, they're lying, he told a reporter. That statement was revolutionary. No one talked about trauma back then, especially not heroes, yet Audie Murphy did. He spoke for the men who couldn't find the words. To dull the nightmares, he turned to sleeping pills, gambling, and long hours at racetracks. He'd disappear for days, chasing quiet in the roar of engines. The winnings never lasted, neither did the relief. His first marriage, to actress Wanda Hendricks, collapsed within 2 years. She later revealed how Murphy once woke from a nightmare, grabbed his pistol, and aimed at shadows only he could see. To her it was terror, to him it was survival. In 1951 he married Pamela Archer, a former flight attendant who saw the wounded soldier beneath the movie star. She grounded him. 2 sons, a modest home, and some fragile peace followed. But even Pamela admitted that when darkness fell, Audie was never fully present. Part of him, she said later, was always back in the war. Murphy's openness about his condition made him a quiet revolutionary. He testified before Congress about neglected veterans, visited VA hospitals, and demanded research into combat trauma. He wasn't doing it for sympathy. He was doing it for the men who came home and couldn't explain why they couldn't sleep, why they flinched at fireworks, why they felt safer in danger than in peace. Psychologist Dr. Matthew Sullivan later called Murphy decades ahead of his time. He was trying to tell America that heroes bleed inside too, but the institutions he confronted weren't ready to listen. And some of those institutions, as we now know, had more to fear than embarrassment. Because while Audie Murphy fought his invisible war, he began hearing other veterans' stories, whispers from hospital wards, rumors from VA staff, tales of strange treatments and missing records. He thought he was helping men find healing. Instead, he was walking straight toward something no one was supposed to uncover. The soldier who once survived German bullets was about to step onto a battlefield where the enemy wore suits and the weapons were secrets. A hero who wouldn't stay quiet. Audie Murphy could have faded quietly into Hollywood nostalgia. He could have lived off residual checks, made a few cameo appearances, and slipped into the comfort of being America's favorite war hero turned actor. But that wasn't who he was. As the 1960s marched forward with protests raging, new wars erupting, and veterans once again forgotten, Murphy couldn't look away. He didn't need a script to tell him what he saw: a new generation of broken soldiers returning from Korea and Vietnam, facing the same government neglect he'd spent years confronting. So he took it personally. And then he took it public. Murphy began visiting VA hospitals, not for publicity, but to talk to men like him, silent, shaken, drugged into compliance. He sat with them, listened, heard stories that didn't add up, stories about experimental treatments, about memory loss, about psychological conditioning disguised as therapy. At first he thought it was just mismanagement, bureaucratic failure, a system too big to care. But soon, patterns emerged, patterns that whispered something darker. By the late 1960s, Murphy was no longer just a Hollywood figure. He had become an unofficial investigator, asking too many questions, showing up at facilities without invitations, requesting files, demanding transparency. And then he had an idea. He began developing a television series, a semi-dramatic show based on real stories from veterans across the country. But this wasn't going to be another sanitized war drama. This was Murphy's Trojan horse, a vehicle to expose what he believed was systematic abuse inside the Veterans Administration. He wasn't interested in vague allegories. He was collecting evidence: names, locations, dates, hidden files, broken men. And the deeper he dug, the darker the picture became. According to journalist Michael Thorne, who later investigated the case, Murphy had uncovered signs of classified research happening inside VA hospitals, programs involving psychological manipulation, unauthorized drug trials, even alleged connections to behavior control experiments that would later echo the horrors of MK Ultra. Murphy wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was a soldier, a realist. And when he saw men being used like lab rats under the guise of treatment, he knew exactly what it looked like: government betrayal. Worse still, he wasn't just hearing rumors, he was documenting proof. He kept a small briefcase, according to close friends, that never left his side. In it were files, notes, testimonies, and possibly even names of officials connected to the programs. He told a friend in early 1971, "If this gets out, they're gonna have hell to pay." He also began scheduling meetings with journalists from the Washington Post and New York Times. He wanted the truth public, unfiltered, unedited, and he was getting close, too close. Because just days before those meetings were set to happen, something else was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Government agencies had begun monitoring Murphy more closely. His phone lines were tapped, his mail intercepted. Informants were planted around him. He had become, in the eyes of certain institutions, a priority threat. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was credible. This wasn't some washed-up actor spewing nonsense. This was Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier in American history. And if he said something was wrong, people would believe him. And that made him dangerous. The final flight that made no sense. May 28, 1971. A fog-covered morning in Virginia. Audie Murphy climbed aboard a twin-engine Aero Commander 680, heading to a quiet business meeting that was supposed to be routine. But within 15 minutes, the plane was gone, obliterated on the slopes of Brush Mountain, killing all 6 on board instantly. America mourned. A legend lost to the sky. The news said it was tragic, but unsurprising. Bad weather, pilot misjudgment, just another aviation accident. Or so we were told. But behind the scenes, even experienced pilots were puzzled. The man flying that plane, Herman Butler, wasn't some rookie with shaky instincts. He had over 8,000 hours of flight time and a solid reputation for caution, especially in rough conditions. So why, on that morning, with fog choking the mountains and visibility near zero, would a seasoned pilot with Murphy on board ignore every safety protocol and take off anyway? That's where the first questions began. And they've only grown louder with time. Aviation analyst Richard Collins reviewed the flight details years later and called Butler's decision-making inexplicable. The plane was flying unusually low, well below the minimum safe altitude for that area. The path he took wasn't the safest. In fact, it wasn't even logical. And then there were the witnesses. 3 local residents, independent of each other, reported hearing something strange before the crash. Not just the sound of impact, but an explosion in midair, followed by a pause. Then the crash. Their statements were noted briefly, then dismissed, folded neatly into the final NTSB report, which cited pilot error and weather complications. Case closed. But something was off. Because even the wreckage didn't behave like wreckage should. Debris was scattered in a way that didn't align with a normal crash. Critical components were missing entirely, including control surfaces that should have been found on site. Aviation forensics expert Rebecca Chen later reviewed the crash photos and said flatly, parts that were supposed to be there weren't. Some of those parts didn't come off in the crash. They came off before. And then, years later, a forensic metallurgist named Dr. Howard Kleen made a bombshell discovery. Stress fractures on key components that couldn't have come from impact. They were pre-crash breaks, consistent with sabotage, not accident. Meanwhile, more unsettling details began to surface about Herman Butler, the pilot. Though publicly described as Murphy's friend and pilot for hire, Butler's personnel file, partially declassified in 2015, told a different story. He had flown missions for government contractors. He had connections to Air America, a CIA front operating in Southeast Asia. There were gaps in his work history, unexplained activities during the height of Cold War operations. This wasn't your average private pilot. This was someone who may have worked covert missions. And he just happened to be the man flying the plane that killed the one person threatening to blow the lid off a secret government program. Too many coincidences. Too many silences. And one chilling truth. The briefcase Murphy always carried, the one containing his research and planned disclosures, was never included in the crash site inventory. Gone. Vanished. Like the answers everyone stopped asking for. Secrets buried in the wreckage. For decades, the official story never changed. A tragic crash, a brave soldier, bad weather, nothing more. But in 2018, everything began to unravel. Under the 50-year declassification rule, thousands of Cold War-era intelligence files were released. Files no one expected to mention Audie Murphy. But they did, hundreds of times. According to historian Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, Murphy wasn't just known to federal agencies in the late 1960s, he was actively surveilled. Monitored phone calls, intercepted letters, reports from informants planted in his inner circle. But why? Why would America's most decorated war hero be considered a threat? The answer was buried in something called COINTELPRO, a covert FBI operation designed to infiltrate, discredit, and dismantle subversive threats. Audie Murphy, once paraded as a symbol of patriotic sacrifice, had by 1969 been reclassified as a priority subject. Former FBI agent and whistleblower Samuel Drake reviewed the files and was stunned. The surveillance Murphy was under, he said, was comparable to what we did to Martin Luther King Jr. or radical anti-war leaders. But Murphy wasn't radical. He wasn't leading marches or burning draft cards. He was gathering evidence. And now, we know what he had found. Through interviews and redacted documents, journalist Michael Thorne pieced together Murphy's final investigation. It led to a network of VA hospitals, defense contractors, and shadowy research groups conducting what appeared to be unauthorized psychological experiments on American veterans. These weren't just medical tests. They involved coercive treatments, memory suppression, and behavior modification techniques that eerily resembled what would later be revealed as MK-Ultra, the CIA's infamous mind control program. Murphy had collected names, dates, paper trails. He'd even begun drafting a whistleblower defense fund to protect VA employees who wanted to come forward. He was planning press interviews with the Washington Post and New York Times in June 1971, just days after his fatal flight. But none of those meetings ever happened. And the documents Murphy had compiled? They were said to be in his briefcase, a briefcase that mysteriously vanished from the crash scene. Pamela Murphy, his widow, never believed it was an accident. Neither did their son, Terry Murphy, who later said, "My father survived hundreds of combat missions. He wouldn't get on a plane with a pilot he didn't trust, and he wouldn't be careless with evidence that important." Years later, a former Martinsville airport technician came forward. Under sworn affidavit, he described two unfamiliar men working on Murphy's plane the night before the flight. They had credentials, but weren't part of the regular crew. When he asked about them, his supervisor allegedly said, "Forget you saw anything." And then came the final blow. A forensic reanalysis of the plane's wreckage revealed tool marks on the elevator control system, the part responsible for keeping the nose of the plane stable in flight. The marks weren't from wear and tear. They were consistent with manual tampering. Small, deliberate alterations that wouldn't be caught during pre-flight checks, but would catastrophically fail under stress. According to aviation forensics expert James Michaels, this was surgical, not random failure. It was engineered to look like a tragic mistake. And it worked. For over 5 decades. But the truth didn't disappear. It was buried. And now, piece by piece, it's coming back to light. By now, the trail was no longer just whispers and theories. It was evidence. Concrete, disturbing, and damning. In 2020, a quiet breakthrough came from a source few expected. A retired intelligence operative in his 90s, his identity still protected, submitted a sworn affidavit under strict conditions. He claimed that Audie Murphy's death was not an accident. It was a containment operation, ordered at the highest levels, once Murphy was labeled a priority threat to sensitive federal programs. Though he denied involvement in the actual mechanics of the crash, he confirmed the objective: to neutralize Murphy before he could expose the covert psychological experiments being run through VA hospitals. The statement was chilling, and it matched internal government memos, released around the same time. One such memo, dated June 3, 1971, just 5 days after the crash, read, "Issue resolved per operation redacted. Investigation proceeding as planned with expected conclusions. All assets in place to manage any deviations from narrative." That narrative, of course, was the official story. Pilot error, bad weather, no further questions. And for decades it held, until modern forensic analysis pulled back the curtain. Experts used high-resolution scans and enhanced imagery on crash site photographs. The control system's elevator cables, essential for pitch stability in flight, showed signs of partial scoring, tiny grooves that wouldn't be noticeable during inspection, but would cause failure under the stress of turbulence. Sabotage 101, said Michaels, the aviation forensics expert. It's subtle, almost impossible to detect without modern tools. But once you know what to look for, the intent is obvious. It gets worse. Multiple metallurgical reports confirmed that the fracture patterns on certain components matched deliberate weakening techniques, not stress failure. This wasn't accidental fatigue. It was engineered collapse. And then came a moment that made investigators stop cold. During a secondary review of flight records, it was discovered that known intelligence assets, men connected to surveillance programs, and military psychological operations were in the vicinity of Martinsville in the days leading up to the crash. They weren't assigned there. They weren't announced. They left no official trace. But flight records and hotel logs placed them right where they didn't belong. And the technician's testimony about those two men working on Murphy's plane the night before suddenly wasn't just a curiosity, it was a critical puzzle piece. They had credentials but no names. They performed work that was never logged. And after the crash, they vanished. The final blow came from within the crash site records themselves. Murphy's briefcase, reportedly recovered with his body, was nowhere in the official inventory. Why does that matter? Because according to friends, colleagues, and his own wife, that briefcase contained everything. Research, testimony, names, evidence he planned to share with two of the most powerful newspapers in the country just days later. It's gone. No explanation, no paper trail, just like the truth was supposed to be. And yet, it's all coming out now. The cover-up isn't just suspected, it's visible. In the altered wreckage, in the redacted memos, in the people who were there and told to stay silent. This wasn't some random tragedy. It was a decision, deliberate, calculated, and carried out with terrifying precision. They thought Murphy would take the truth to his grave. But somehow, he's still speaking. A betrayal beyond comprehension. What do you do when the country you risked your life for turns against you? Audie Murphy wasn't a man chasing conspiracy. He was a soldier chasing the truth. And for that, they tried to erase him, silently, permanently. But Murphy's family refused to let him vanish into history as just another plane crash victim. His son, Terry Murphy, spent years fighting for answers, chasing documents, filing petitions, hitting wall after wall of redacted files, lost evidence, and bureaucratic runaround. It's like trying to solve a puzzle while someone keeps hiding the pieces, he said. But we're not giving up. My father never did. Neither will we. And he's not alone. In recent years, veteran advocacy groups, journalists, and even a bipartisan group of U.S. senators have called for a formal reinvestigation into Murphy's death and the VA-linked programs he was probing before he died. But the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs have been slow, non-committal, stonewalling. Analyst Dr. Margaret Chen put it bluntly. If this was truly just a crash, prove it, release everything, let independent investigators see the files. The fact that they won't tells you everything. Because this isn't just about Audie Murphy anymore. It's about every veteran who came home broken and was used. It's about every institution that hides behind red tape while soldiers suffer in silence. And it's about accountability, no matter how long it takes. Historians are now reassessing Murphy's legacy, not just as a battlefield hero, but as a truth teller, a man who faced bullets in France and lies in Washington with the same iron will. He never stopped fighting, says military historian William Porter. When the guns went quiet, he picked a new battle, one just as dangerous, and maybe even more lonely. And let's not forget the cruel irony. Audie Murphy risked his life to defeat fascism, to stop a world where citizens were tools, secrets ruled, and power was unchecked. Only to be silenced by the very system he swore to protect. The trauma he carried made him dangerous, not because it made him unstable, but because it made him empathetic. He saw what other soldiers were enduring, and he couldn't turn away. His nightmares became fuel. His pain became purpose. And that's what made him a target. By standing up for forgotten veterans, by daring to expose classified research on human minds, Audie Murphy became the most inconvenient whistleblower in American history. And they made sure he never got to finish what he started. But here's the thing about truth. You can bury it, delay it, burn the documents and silence the witnesses. But eventually, it finds air. And now, decades later, it's finally rising from the wreckage of Brush Mountain. For Murphy's family. For every soldier experimented on without consent. For every American who still believes in transparency, justice, and accountability, this isn't over. Audie Murphy's final mission wasn't in Europe. It was here, in the shadows of his own country, in the corridors of power that forgot who built them. And if everything we've now learned is true, that he was murdered to protect a lie, then what happened to Audie Murphy wasn't just a betrayal. It was treason. And the fight to expose it may be the most American thing he ever did. Audie Murphy stared down tanks, bullets, and nightmares. But in the end, the thing that may have silenced him was the truth he refused to bury. If this story moved you, if it shocked you, if it made you question everything, don't let it end here. Hit the like button to show that Audie's legacy still matters. Subscribe so you never miss stories they don't want told. And drop a comment below, because your voice helps bring the truth back from the shadows. Audie's final battle wasn't with a rifle. It was with silence. And together, we can make sure he didn't fight it alone.